Snow was already piling up against the frost-bitten windows when the valley's power grid completely failed. Neighbors who had mocked the crazy widow's mud and brick contraption were suddenly freezing in their multi-million-dollar smart homes. By morning, survival wouldn't depend on expensive generators, but on a forgotten, supposedly dangerous, ancient technology. Mud squished beneath Bexley Harding's worn rubber boots as she systematically stomped the mixture of heavy red clay, coarse river sand, and chopped winter wheat straw. She was 55, her silver hair tied back in a messy braid, and her hands were permanently calloused from years of working the unforgiving soil of Cobb Creek, Montana. To the wealthy newcomers who had recently bought up the surrounding acreage, she was an eyesore. To Bexley, she was simply preparing for the inevitable. She knelt beside the massive serpent-like structure dominating her living room. It looked like a long, smooth dirt sofa curling around the perimeter of the cabin, terminating at a rusty 55-gallon steel drum. It was a rocket mass heater, a brilliantly efficient, ancient-inspired system designed to capture and store thermal energy. Instead of sending 90% of the heat up a chimney like a standard fireplace, the rocket heater forced the exhaust gases through a horizontal labyrinth of ductwork buried inside tons of earthen cob. The mud bench would absorb the intense heat and radiate it into the home for days after a single small fire had gone out. Headlights swept across her frosted window panes. A pristine matte black SUV idled in her gravel driveway, its massive engine purring softly. Chad Reynolds stepped out, zipping up an excessively puffy designer jacket. He was the recently self-appointed president of the Cobb Creek Property Owners Association, a former tech executive from San Francisco who believed nature could be conquered with enough lithium-ion batteries, Wi-Fi modules, and buried propane tanks. Trailing nervously behind him was Shania Jenkins. A single father unravel his entire world. A sissy etched in entire because she rented a small cabin on Chad's sprawling property line. Bexley didn't stop packing mud around the exhaust manifold as Chad pushed her front door open without knocking. "Bexley, you cannot be serious with this," Chad said, his voice dripping with condescension as he stared at the half-finished earthen bench. "I warned you last month. You are building an unpermitted, open combustion unit in a residential structure. It looks like a mud hut exploded in your living room." "It's a thermal battery, Chad," Bexley replied calmly, wiping a smear of clay from her forehead. "It burns at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit in the insulated J-tube. It combusts all the smoke and volatile gases. It's significantly safer than that massive bomb of a propane tank you buried next to your foundation." Chad sneered, pulling a laminated sheet of paper from Shania's clipboard. Shania offered Bexley a sympathetic, apologetic glance, holding her coat tightly against the biting November chill. "The insurance underwriters are threatening to drop the community block policy," Chad stated, waving the paper. "They consider this a massive fire hazard. You have a fire burning inside a dirt mound, venting through stovepipes that aren't even vertical. Not to mention the massive, steaming pile of wood chips in your backyard that smells like a landfill." "Ow, that is a Jean-Pain compost mound," Bexley corrected him, her tone even. "It circulates water through miles of plastic tubing buried in decomposing wood chips. The bacteria generate enough heat to give me hot water all winter without drawing a single watt from the grid. You should try it. The grid is fragile out here." Chad let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Fragile? I have a $20,000 automated Generac system wired to a 1,000-gallon buried tank. I have smart thermostats that monitor the ambient temperature of every room in my house from my phone. I don't need to roll in the mud like a primitive caveman to stay warm. You have exactly 1 week to dismantle this hazard, Bexley, or the association will place a lien on your property. and bring the county fire marshal out here." A storm is coming, Chad," Bexley said quietly, finally standing up to meet his gaze. "A real one. The radio said the polar vortex is fracturing. The jet stream is collapsing. They're predicting temperatures we haven't seen in this valley for 80 years. Then I'll turn my thermostat up to 72, Chad replied, turning on his heel. 1 week, Bexley. He stormed out, the heavy door slamming behind him. Shania lingered for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry, Bayer," she whispered. "He's threatening to evict me if I don't back him up on the board. My electric baseboards barely work as it is, and Lily has been coughing all week." "Stay safe, Shania," Bexley said softly, reaching into a basket and handing the younger woman a bundle of dried mullein and thick wool socks. "If the power drops, you don't wait around in that rental. You come straight here. Do you understand?" Shania nodded, her eyes wide with anxiety, before rushing out to join Chad in his heated luxury vehicle. Over the next 48 hours, the sky bruised into a sickly, violent shade of purple. The local weather stations began sounding emergency tones. Meteorologists used words like bombogenesis and historic Arctic blast. The air pressure plummeted so rapidly that Bexley's ears popped as she brought in her final loads of firewood. Unlike the massive heavy logs required for a traditional fireplace, her rocket mass heater only required small dry branches and twigs. She carried in 3 small baskets of willow scrub and pine offcuts, enough fuel to last her a week. Down the valley, she could hear the chaotic rumble of Chad's heavy machinery as he had bulk deliveries of propane and diesel rushed to his estate, preparing to fight the cold with brute mechanical force. He was relying on complex systems with hundreds of moving parts, delicate sensors, and digital motherboards. Bexley was relying on dirt, gravity, and fire. The storm didn't just arrive, it slammed into the Bitterroot Mountains like a physical wall of white. At 4 p.m., the wind speeds copped 70 miles per hour, carrying a blinding slurry of pulverized ice that scoured the paint off vehicles and snapped century-old pine trees like brittle toothpicks. By 6 p.m., the temperature had dropped from a manageable 20 degrees to 10 below zero. At exactly 7:14 p.m., the sky lit up with a brilliant, terrifying cascade of blue and green flashes as the valley's main transformers catastrophically failed under the weight of the ice. The entire grid of Cobb Creek blinked out of existence. Inside Chad Reynolds' sprawling, steel and glass mansion, the darkness lasted exactly 10 seconds. With a muffled, heavy roar, his massive industrial generator kicked into life. Emergency LED lights illuminated his sleek, minimalist living room. The digital displays on his smart thermostats rebooted, glowing cheerfully as the forced air furnace resumed pushing hot air through the massive house. Chad poured himself a generous glass of imported scotch, standing by his floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows watching the blizzard rage outside. He felt a surge of smug satisfaction. Let the crazy old woman in her mud hut freeze, he thought. He had bought his way out of nature's wrath. But out in the dark, the temperature was entering a terrifying, lethal domain. It hit 20 below zero, then 30 below. At 40 degrees below zero, the laws of physics begin to behave in ways modern infrastructure is rarely designed to handle. Steel becomes brittle, motor oil turns the consistency of thick molasses, and propane, the lifeblood of Chad's survival, stops being a gas. Propane relies on ambient heat to boil and vaporize inside its tank before traveling up the lines to a generator or furnace. At negative 44 degrees Fahrenheit, propane remains a stagnant liquid. Even at negative 35, the pressure inside the tank drops so drastically that it cannot push enough vapor through the regulator to feed a massive, fuel-hungry V8 generator engine. At 9:30 p.m., The lights in Chad's house flickered. The steady, powerful roar of his generator outside began to surge and stutter, a mechanical wheeze echoing through the howling wind. Chad set his scotch down, a sudden cold knot forming in his stomach. He pulled up his smart home app, but the Wi-Fi router was flashing red. The internet lines on the highway had been severed hours ago, meaning his cloud-based diagnostic tools were completely useless. Outside, the generator's computer desperately commanded the intake valves to open wider, starving for fuel that wasn't there. The regulator, exposed to the brutal wind chill, froze completely solid. With a final violent shudder, the generator died. Absolute silence fell over the mansion, instantly replaced by the terrifying shriek of the blizzard tearing at the glass walls. Because Chad's house was designed with vast open spaces and towering windows, it had virtually no thermal mass. Without the constant, massive injection of artificial heat, the temperature inside the house began to freefall. A mile down the road, Shania Jenkins was living a nightmare. The moment the power failed, her poorly insulated rental cabin became a death trap. Her electric baseboard heaters went cold. Within 2 hours, she could see her own breath pluming in the living room. She had dressed 3-year-old Lily in 2 snowsuits and wrapped her in every blanket they owned. But the cold was an aggressive physical entity seeping through the floorboards. By midnight, the pipes in the kitchen wall violently ruptured, spraying water that froze into jagged icicles before it even hit the linoleum floor. "Mummy, it hurts," Lily whimpered, her lips taking on a terrifying blue hue. Shania knew if they stayed, they would be dead by morning. She remembered Bexley's offer, but the thought of trekking through the blizzard terrified her. Chad's house was closer, barely a quarter-mile up the hill. She knew he had a massive generator. She had seen the lights. Wrapping Lily securely against her chest inside a heavy parka, Shania forced the front door open. The wind hit her with the force of a freight train, knocking the breath from her lungs. The cold was agonizing, feeling like a million tiny needles driving into any exposed skin. She waded through thigh-high snow drifts, blind, navigating only by the faint silhouette of the trees. It took her 20 agonizing minutes to reach Chad's driveway. When she finally stumbled up to his massive oak front door, there were no lights. She pounded on the wood with numb fists, screaming over the wind. Minutes passed. Finally, the door cracked open a few inches. Chad stood there, illuminated by the weak beam of a dying flashlight. He was wearing his designer coat, a wool blanket wrapped haphazardly around his shoulders. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "Chad, please," Shania begged, pushing against the door. "Lily is freezing. Your generator, it's dead." Chad snapped, panic edging his voice, trying to push the door closed against the wind. The whole system crashed. The house is already at 30 degrees and dropping fast. "We just need shelter. Please, let us in." "No," Chad shouted, his eyes wide with irrational fear. "If I open the door anymore, I lose whatever heat is trapped in the foyer. Go back to your cabin, Shania." Before she could process his sheer cowardice, Chad shoved the heavy door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. Shania fell backward into the snow, sobbing, the wind immediately stealing the sound from her mouth. She looked down at Lily, whose eyes were heavy. Her shivering slowing down, a dangerous sign of profound hypothermia. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. But then, as she looked down the valley into the abyss of the storm, she saw it. There was no blazing fire, no floodlights. Just a tiny, persistent plume of white vapor rising steadily from the chimney of Bexley Harding's cabin, illuminated faintly by the moon breaking through the swirling snow. It wasn't smoke. It was clean, pure steam, the byproduct of a perfect, complete combustion. Driven by raw maternal adrenaline, Shania forced herself up. She didn't walk. She dragged herself through the waist-deep snow, moving entirely on instinct. Every step was a battle against the lethargy dragging at her muscles. The quarter-mile felt like an eternity. When she finally fell against Bexley's thick wooden door, she didn't even have the strength to knock. The door immediately flew open. Bexley stood there, bathed in a warm, golden glow, pulling Shania and the child inside and slamming the heavy door shut against the howling void. Shania collapsed onto the floor, bracing herself for the residual chill of a drafty cabin. Instead, she gasped. The air inside was thick, fragrant, and profoundly hot. It was easily 75 degrees. There were no noisy blowers, no roaring furnaces. The silence was only broken by a low, rhythmic, rushing sound like a distant jet engine coming from the steel barrel in the center of the room. Bexley quickly peeled the frozen layers off Shania and Lily. "Get on the bench," Bexley ordered gently, guiding them toward the massive, curving mud structure that dominated the room. Shania sat down, and a gasp escaped her lips. The earthen cob was radiating a deep, penetrating, therapeutic heat. It wasn't just warming the air. The infrared heat from the tons of thermal mass was soaking directly into her bones, melting the deadly cold from her core. Lily began to cry a loud, healthy wail of returning sensation. Bexley handed Shania a mug of steaming cedar tea. "Drink this. The water is fresh from the compost line, still pumping out at 120 degrees. Shania looked around the glowing, incredibly warm sanctuary, listening to the furious storm shattering the world outside. She traced her hand along the hot, smooth surface of the mud bench. "He said this was dangerous," Shania whispered, tears of relief streaking down her thawing face. Bexley fed 3 dry pine twigs into the intake hole of the J-tube. The fire sucked the flames inward horizontally with a fierce, efficient roar. "Arrogance is dangerous, Shania," Bexley said softly, pulling a thick wool blanket over the mother and child. "The earth always provides. You just have to know how to listen to it." Daylight brought no relief to Cop Creek. The morning sun was a pale, useless disk behind the swirling whiteout. Inside his sprawling estate, Chad Reynolds was experiencing the terrifying reality of thermal collapse. His breath hung in the air like thick smoke. The indoor temperature had plummeted to 4 degrees above zero. Frost coated the inside of his floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the panoramic view he had paid millions for. The silence of the dead house was suddenly shattered by a sharp, violent crack, the sound of a 2-inch copper water main bursting inside the drywall, though the water inside was frozen solid enough to prevent an immediate flood. Chad was shivering uncontrollably beneath a pile of supposedly high-tech, 0-degree sleeping bags. His phone was a dead, black rectangle. The high-end, decorative gas fireplace in his living room was useless. It relied on electronic ignition and a powered draft inducer. Desperation overtaking reason, Chad dragged a heavy oak dining chair into the center of his living room, smashed it with a dumbbell, and tried to light a fire on his Italian porcelain tiles. Without a chimney draft, the thick, acrid smoke instantly filled the room, choking him, stinging his eyes until he was forced to stamp it out. He lay on the floor, coughing violently, the cold seeping through his heavy ski pants. He was a tech millionaire, a master of modern logistics, and he was going to die in his own living room. Through the frosted glass, his bloodshot eyes caught a glimpse of the valley below. A steady, defiant plume of white steam was still rising from the chimney of Bexley Harding's cabin. Survival instinct finally crushed his ego. Chad wrapped himself in a designer comforter, tied it around his waist with a cord, and stumbled out his front door. The trek down the hill was a battle against nature. The snow was chest-high in the drifts. The wind chill ripped through his expensive synthetic layers. His legs grew heavy, his mind foggy, the classic, deceptive symptoms of late-stage hypothermia. The urge to just lie down in the snow and sleep was overpowering. He fell twice, crawling the last 50 yards. When he reached Bexley's door, he couldn't even raise his arm to knock. He simply collapsed against the heavy timber, his vision fading to black. Inside, Bexley was frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet directly on top of the steel barrel of the rocket mass heater. The metal surface easily reached 400 degrees, doubling as a perfect off-grid cooktop. Shania was reading a story to Lily, both of them lounging comfortably on the massive earthen bench, wearing only light sweaters. A dull thud against the front door interrupted the peaceful morning. Bexley set the skillet aside, her instincts sharp. She unlatched the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door inward. Chad Reynolds spilled onto the floorboards, a rigid, ice-covered lump of expensive fabrics. His lips were blue, his skin chalky white, and he was completely unresponsive. "Help me get him to the bench," Bexley shouted. Shania didn't hesitate. Together, the two women dragged the heavy, frozen man across the room. They hoisted him onto the flat, heated surface of the cob structure. Bexley immediately began stripping off his icy, wet outer layers. "He's practically a block of ice," Shania panicked, feeling his rigid arm. "The cob will do the work," Bexley instructed calmly, grabbing a pair of thick wool blankets. "It's radiating steady, deep infrared heat. It mimics the sun. It will warm his blood safely without shocking his heart like a hot bath would." For the next 3 hours, Chad remained unconscious. The massive dirt structure, holding millions of BTUs of stored thermal energy from a few handfuls of twigs, went to work. The gentle, penetrating heat soaked into his frozen muscles, expanding his contracted blood vessels, slowly drawing him back from the brink of death. Awareness returned to Chad in fragments. First came the smell of wood smoke, not the choking, acrid smoke from his failed indoor fire, but a faint, sweet aroma of toasted pine. Then came the sensation of heat. It wasn't the dry, suffocating blast of forced air heating. It was a heavy, comforting warmth that felt like a thick, heated, weighted blanket wrapped around his bones. He opened his eyes. He was lying on the very mud bench he had threatened to bulldoze just 48 hours ago. Shania was sitting a few feet away, sipping tea and watching him cautiously. Bexley was kneeling by the intake tube, feeding 3 small sticks into the fire. The flames roared horizontally, a mesmerizing vortex of combustion that consumed every particle of smoke. "Don't try to stand up yet," Bexley said, not looking away from the fire. "Your core temperature dropped dangerously low. Your heart needs time to stabilize." Chad stared at the ceiling, then at the steel barrel, and finally at the small basket of twigs beside Bexley. "How?" His voice cracked, dry and raspy. "How is it this warm in here?" "Thermal mass," Bexley replied simply. "Modern houses are built like paper bags filled with hot air. The moment the blower stops, the heat escapes. This bench is 4 tons of clay, sand, and rock. I fired it for 2 hours last night. It will radiate heat for another 2 days, even if I don't light another match." Chad closed his eyes, a profound sense of shame washing over him. He thought of his $20,000 generator, his buried propane tanks, his smart thermostats, all defeated by a drop in air pressure and temperature. Then he looked at Bexley, a woman he had mocked and tried to evict, who was surviving a historic catastrophe with dirt, scrap metal, and twigs. "My house," Chad whispered. "The pipes." "I heard them burst." "I imagine so," Bexley said gently, handing him a mug of hot bone broth. "Without a heat source, the expansion of the ice will destroy the plumbing. The sheetrock will be ruined. But you are alive, Chad. Houses can be rebuilt." He took the mug with trembling hands, the warmth of the clay cup seeping into his thawing palms. He looked at Shania, the single mother he had locked out in the storm, who was now safe and warm because of the very system he had deemed a hazard. "I'm sorry," Chad croaked, tears welling in his eyes. "Shania, Bexley." "I was a fool. Drink your broth," Bexley commanded mildly. "The storm won't break until tomorrow. We have plenty of firewood. We'll be fine." For the next 2 days, the 3 adults and the toddler lived in the small 80-degree sanctuary of the Cobb cabin, while the outside world remained a frozen, deadly wasteland. Chad watched, fascinated and humbled, as Bexley operated her home. She cooked their meals on the barrel. She drew boiling hot water from the champagne compost pile outside, which was steadily breaking down wood chips and generating massive amounts of heat despite the negative 40-degree air surrounding it. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally died. The sun broke through the heavy clouds, illuminating a landscape buried under 4 feet of pristine snow. By noon, the distant rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed up the valley. A massive county snowplow, followed by 2 rescue vehicles, battered its way up Cobb Creek Road. Emergency responders, led by Fire Marshal Arthur Higgins, were conducting welfare checks on the remote properties. When Higgins and his team forced their way into Chad's mansion, they found a disaster zone. The burst pipes and flooded the lower levels before freezing into a solid indoor skating rink. The drywall was ruined. The expensive hardwood floors buckled and shattered. The house was a multi-million-dollar icebox. Fearing the worst, Higgins led his team down the trail to Bexley's cabin. They expected to find frozen bodies. Instead, Bexley opened the door, a blast of warm, fragrant air hitting the freezing responders. Behind her, Chad Reynolds was sitting on the mud bench, holding Lily on his lap, while Shania poured a fresh round of cedar tea. Marshal Higgins blinked in astonishment, stepping inside and pulling off his frost-covered mask. "Bexley, how in God's name?" "It's a sauna in here. We saw Reynolds's place. The entire grid is down. The propane regulators across the county failed." Chad stood up, walking toward the fire marshal. He looked entirely different from the arrogant tech executive of the previous week. He looked grounded, humbled. "She built a rocket mass heater, Arthur," Chad said, his voice carrying a new, respectful authority. "It's the most efficient, ingenious survival tool I've ever seen. It saved my life. It saved all of our lives." Higgins looked at the massive earthen bench, then at his clipboard. "Well, officially, there was a complaint filed about this structure being an unpermitted hazard. My office was asked to inspect it for immediate dismantling." Chad reached out, placing his hand firmly over the marshal's clipboard. "I filed that complaint, Marshal, and I am officially retracting it. Furthermore, as the president of the Property Owners Association, I'll be drafting an addendum to our bylaws protecting alternative, off-grid heating systems." Bexley smiled, quietly feeding another twig into the J-tube. The winter of the Great Freeze would be talked about in Cobb Creek for decades. It was the year the multi-million-dollar smart homes failed, and the year a community learned that true resilience wasn't bought with apps and automatic generators. True resilience came from understanding the earth, respecting the elements, and sometimes relying on a little bit of mud and fire. If you were captivated by this intense story of survival, innovation, and the ultimate triumph of ancient wisdom over modern arrogance, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves off-grid living, survival stories, or just a deeply satisfying plot twist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible real-life story. Stay warm out there.